He stabbed her over 100 times. Then he took her 2-year-old son and fed him to alligators. What seemed like a random act of violence quickly unraveled into a horrifying web of obsession, hidden paternity, and a twisted revenge years in the making. This isn't just a crime. It's a nightmare born in the shadows of the Florida Everglades. What really happened to Jessica Lane and her little boy Eli? The truth will leave you speechless. Jessica Lane was only 26, but to the people in her small Florida town, she seemed much older than her years. She carried herself with a calm grace that made her instantly likable. Her days were simple, working long shifts at a local diner, spending evenings with her 2-year-old son Eli, and retreating into the quiet of her small rented home nestled near the edge of the Everglades. Jessica's life was modest, but full of love. Eli was her entire world, and everything she did, every dollar saved, every extra shift taken, was for him. Their house was tucked away behind rows of palm trees and thick brush. It wasn't much to look at from the outside, but inside, it was warm and full of life. The refrigerator was covered in scribbled crayon drawings. Eli's toys were always scattered across the floor. A faint scent of baby lotion lingered in the air, mixed with the sweet aroma of whatever Jessica had been cooking last. There was peace in that house, until there wasn't. Jessica was known to walk Eli every afternoon. She would strap him into his tiny blue stroller and head toward the nearby trail that bordered the Everglades. It was dangerous territory, but Jessica kept to the path and never went far. The neighbors would wave as she passed, and Eli's giggles echoed through the trees. To outsiders, their bond seemed unbreakable. Jessica had no known enemies, no drama in her life. At least not anymore. A few had whispered about a troubled relationship she had been in months earlier, but that seemed like a closed chapter. On the morning of July 13th, everything started as usual. Jessica got up early, made breakfast for Eli, and called her boss to say she'd be in a little late. Eli had a slight fever, nothing serious, but she wanted to monitor it for a few hours. That was the last time anyone heard from her. She never arrived at work. She didn't call back. No one could reach her. At first, her co-workers weren't too worried. Maybe she was busy or her phone had died. But as hours passed and the sun dipped below the horizon, a growing sense of unease began to settle over the diner. Jessica was never late without a reason. She never missed work without notice. By 8 p.m., her manager decided to drive by her house. The lights inside were off. The car was in the driveway, but no one answered the door. After knocking several times and calling her phone without luck, the manager contacted the sheriff's department for a welfare check. Deputies arrived 20 minutes later. They knocked. No answer. Then they tried the windows. All locked. The backyard was quiet, overgrown, still. There was no sign of movement inside. That's when one of the deputies noticed a red smear on the inside of the glass pane near the back door. They broke the door open. What they found inside shattered everything they thought they knew about Jessica Lane. The cozy home had been transformed into a nightmare. Blood was everywhere, on the walls, the counters, soaked into the floorboards. Jessica's lifeless body was sprawled on the kitchen floor, brutally stabbed over and over again. The violence was overwhelming. The house didn't look like the scene of a simple murder. It looked like an explosion of rage, but something was even more horrifying than the murder itself. Eli was gone. His small crib was empty, his stuffed animals scattered as if thrown. His favorite blanket lay crumpled on the floor, stained with blood. There were no signs of struggle from Eli, no screams reported, no broken doors or windows. It was as if he had vanished. The quiet home near the edge of the Everglades, once filled with laughter and bedtime stories, had turned into a blood-soaked mystery. What happened to Jessica was terrifying, but what happened to Eli was still unknown, and that was even worse. The officers who entered Jessica Lane's home that evening were hardened professionals, used to difficult scenes, but what they witnessed shook even the most experienced among them. The living room looked like it had been left in a rush. A small plastic cup of juice lay spilled on the carpet, a cartoon playing silently on the TV. Eli's tiny shoes sat near the front door, untouched. Everything appeared normal, until they reached the kitchen. Jessica's body was sprawled out, near the center of the room, surrounded by a thick pool of blood. Her wounds were severe, too many to count at first glance. The brutality of the stabbing left the forensic team stunned. Whoever had done this wasn't just trying to kill. This was rage, personal and deliberate. Her shirt was torn, her hands cut deeply as if she had tried to defend herself, and the blood patterns on the wall suggested she had crawled a few feet before collapsing. There were no weapons in sight. The house hadn't been ransacked. Nothing had been stolen. Her purse still lay on the dining table, untouched. Her phone, cracked but functioning, was found under the kitchen counter. What stood out more than the violence, however, was the absence of Eli. The entire house was scoured for any sign of the toddler. His crib was untouched, but empty. Diapers were still stacked neatly by the changing table. In the bathroom, his toothbrush was sitting in its holder next to Jessica's. There were no bloody footprints from a child, no signs of him being hurt inside the house. It was as if someone had specifically taken him, but why? The search began immediately. Officers expanded the scene, going door to door through the neighborhood, asking if anyone had seen anything unusual. Most neighbors were already asleep or had been inside all day because of the afternoon rain. One neighbor said she had heard a loud thump around 1 a.m., but thought it was thunder. Another reported seeing a man's silhouette near the backyard fence the night before, but couldn't recall details. No face, no vehicle, nothing useful. K-9 units were brought in to track Eli's scent, starting from his crib and moving outward. The dogs led officers through the back door and into the overgrown brush that bordered the property. The trail continued until it suddenly stopped near the edge of the Everglades. There, officers found something that turned their growing fear into full-blown horror. A small piece of fabric, soaked in blood, half buried in the mud. It matched the pattern of Eli's favorite pajamas. The swamp near Jessica's house was vast and dangerous. It was a tangle of thick trees, dark water, and predators. Alligators were known to live there, along with snakes and other wildlife. The idea that a toddler could be taken into that environment, especially at night, was nearly unthinkable. But as the hours passed and no sign of Eli emerged, the grim reality began to sink in. By the next morning, dive teams were called in. Boats combed the water. Drones scanned from above. Volunteers lined up to search the banks. Flyers with Eli's face were distributed across town. The entire community held its breath, praying for a miracle. Then just before sunset, one of the divers surfaced with a small backpack. It was waterlogged, covered in mud, and had several deep tears. Inside, they found a blood-stained toddler, shirt, a broken toy car, and a pacifier. DNA testing would later confirm the blood belonged to Eli. The case had gone from a brutal domestic homicide to something much worse. A 2-year-old boy had vanished into the swamp, and all signs pointed toward a planned and deliberate abduction after murder. But the question remained. Who would do this to Jessica and her child? And why? Authorities now believed this wasn't a random act. Someone had targeted Jessica, and they had taken Eli for a reason. The investigation was about to take a dark and unexpected turn. As the investigation deepened, detectives began piecing together the final hours of Jessica Lane's life. Her phone records showed no unusual calls. Her recent texts were innocent and routine, messages to co-workers, reminders to pay bills, and a short exchange with her landlord about a leaking faucet. Nothing pointed to a threat. But when investigators checked Jessica's old restraining order files, a name immediately stood out: Nathan Cole. Nathan was a 32-year-old man with a long criminal history. He had spent several years in prison for aggravated assault and had only been released 6 months before Jessica's murder. During a brief period of freedom, he had managed to reconnect with Jessica, someone he had met years earlier through a mutual friend. For a few weeks they had dated casually, but Jessica quickly realized Nathan was not stable. She broke things off when he became controlling and aggressive. She later reported to police that Nathan had shown up at her work uninvited and left threatening notes on her doorstep. The restraining order Jessica filed was granted but expired 3 months before her death. After that, she didn't report any new issues. Police believed she may have thought Nathan had moved on, or hoped he had. When they ran Nathan's name through the system again, they discovered he had failed to check in with his parole officer 2 weeks earlier. That alone was enough to trigger an arrest warrant. But now, with the murder and Eli's disappearance, he became the prime suspect. Detectives moved quickly. They began searching for Nathan's known hangouts: motels, abandoned buildings, places he was known to hide when on the run. The town's atmosphere turned tense. News of Jessica's murder and the missing child had already gone viral, but now people were terrified to learn that a violent fugitive might still be nearby. On the 3rd day of the search, officers received a tip from a park ranger who spotted an abandoned car near a remote service road on the edge of the Everglades. It matched the description of a vehicle Nathan had once driven, a dented gray sedan with a missing hubcap. Inside the car they found trash, cigarette butts, and a crumpled photo of Jessica and Eli. In the trunk was something even more chilling: a shovel, a roll of duct tape, and a plastic bag containing children's socks, one of which had dried, blood on it. Still, there was no sign of Nathan himself. Search dogs picked up his scent and followed it into the swamp. The trail led to a small wooden hunting shack deep in the brush. The shack was empty, but the floor was littered with beer cans, fast food wrappers, and cigarette ash. One of the walls had markings scratched into the wood: names, dates, and one word repeated several times: mine. Forensics later confirmed Nathan's fingerprints throughout the shack. His presence there was undeniable. But the most damning discovery came from a blood sample found on the edge of a rusted sink. It belonged to Eli. Somehow the boy had been brought to this shack after his mother was killed. Investigators now feared the worst. They believed Nathan had murdered Jessica, abducted Eli, and hidden in the swamp to avoid capture. Given his violent past and the evidence of blood, they were no longer sure if the child was still alive. That same day, a wildlife officer found another piece of evidence floating near a marshy bend in the swamp: a toddler's shoe, half-eaten and torn. It was confirmed to belong to Eli Lane. The walls were closing in on Nathan Cole. He had gone from ex-con to fugitive to the most wanted man in the state. Officers knew they were racing against time, not just to capture him, but to learn the full extent of what he had done. The picture was growing darker by the minute, and the truth was far more terrifying than anyone had expected. The search for Nathan Cole entered its most critical stage as law enforcement agencies across Florida coordinated a massive manhunt. Airboats sliced through the dark waters of the Everglades while helicopters circled above, scanning for any trace of movement beneath the dense canopy of trees. The ground teams, composed of police, SWAT units, and wildlife officials, pushed deeper into the swamp's heart, facing harsh terrain, suffocating heat, and the constant threat of wild predators. Every passing hour without answers only increased the sense of dread surrounding the case. Investigators worked around the clock, reviewing every piece of evidence they had. Forensic experts confirmed that the blood on the toddler's clothing and the shack's sink was Eli's. They also found trace DNA belonging to Nathan under Jessica's fingernails, confirming that she had fought back in her final moments. Combined with the photo in his abandoned car and the disturbing writing inside the shack, the case against him was undeniable. What remained uncertain was Eli's fate. Then came a break. A fisherman reported seeing a man matching Nathan's description near a remote riverbank just before dawn. He said the man looked filthy, paranoid, and was carrying what appeared to be a backpack and a knife. Officers immediately responded to the tip, locking down a 3-mile radius around the area. The swamp became a trap, and Nathan was now cornered. That evening, as the sun dipped below the trees and the forest turned to shadows, a team of officers spotted movement near an old boathouse deep within the mangroves. Cautiously, they approached, weapons drawn, hearts pounding. The structure looked like it hadn't been used in years: rusted metal sheets, a broken dock, and moss-covered wood. But inside, they found signs of recent activity: footprints, fresh cigarette butts, and leftover food. It was clear Nathan had been there, possibly still nearby. Then they saw something floating in the water just past the dock. At first it looked like a piece of clothing, but as they pulled it from the water, horror struck again. It was Eli's baby blanket, soaked and torn, wrapped around a small stuffed animal. Nearby, caught between tree roots, was another plastic bag. Inside were fragments of what appeared to be bone. The area was sealed off immediately. Forensic teams arrived to examine the site. They confirmed the blanket and toy belonged to Eli. The bone fragments, once tested, were determined to be from a toddler, most likely him. The location was declared a secondary crime scene, and based on the positioning of items and the evidence recovered, investigators made a chilling conclusion. Nathan had likely fed Eli's body to the swamp's predators, including alligators. The public was devastated. News outlets broadcasted the findings in stunned silence. The nation grieved for the little boy who had vanished in the dark, brutal silence of the Everglades. Jessica Lane's murder had been tragic, but what happened to her son was unthinkable. Just when officers believed the nightmare couldn't get worse, a new twist emerged. Detectives uncovered a burner phone from Nathan's shack. On it were dozens of untraceable messages sent to an unknown number. The content of the texts hinted that Nathan hadn't acted entirely alone. One message read, "It's done. She didn't scream much. The kid went quiet fast." Another said, "Keep your promise. I don't want to disappear for nothing." The tone of the texts suggested a deal had been made, but with whom? A fresh wave of panic set in. If someone else had planned or helped execute this crime, they were still out there. And they had used Nathan as a weapon. The focus of the investigation suddenly shifted from hunting a lone killer to uncovering a hidden conspiracy. The Everglades had swallowed the boy, but the real story was far from over. Eerie. Discovery of the burner phone changed everything. Detectives now faced the chilling possibility that Jessica Lane's murder and Eli's horrific death were not simply the acts of a deranged man, but part of a more calculated plan. The texts revealed cold, transactional language. Terms like done, handled, and disappear suggested Nathan may have been a pawn in something bigger. But the phone was unregistered, and the number on the other end had been wiped clean, making it difficult to trace. Still, investigators didn't stop. They subpoenaed cell phone tower records and began analyzing location pings from the days leading up to Jessica's death. One number kept appearing near her house during odd hours, sometimes parked just a block away, sometimes even closer. It didn't match Nathan's number, but it was frequently active in the same areas Nathan had visited. When the records were pulled, the number was linked to a burner phone purchased under a fake name from a gas station 2 towns over. Surveillance footage from the store finally gave detectives a new lead. The man on camera buying the burner wasn't Nathan. He was tall, wore a baseball cap pulled low, and looked far more composed than Nathan ever did. Using facial recognition software, detectives identified him as Gerald Rivers, a 45-year-old man who worked in private security and had no known connection to Jessica on the surface. But a deeper look into Jessica's past revealed a disturbing connection. A few years ago, when Jessica worked briefly at a casino as a waitress, Gerald was employed there as a head of security. Several former co-workers remembered him, quiet, intense, and always watching people. Jessica had once mentioned to a friend that he made her uncomfortable. She never filed a report, and there was no record of harassment. But that brief overlap was all investigators needed to start digging into Gerald's background. They soon discovered Gerald had a fascination with clean crimes, cases with no direct ties, no motive, no trail. His search history included articles about missing persons, remote crime scenes, and forensic loopholes. Even more disturbingly, Gerald's financial records showed a series of large cash withdrawals just days before Jessica's murder. Detectives suspected he had paid Nathan to carry out the attack and possibly promised him a way out afterward. When police arrived at Gerald's home, he was gone. The place had been cleaned out. No electronics, no notes, no signs of recent activity. But hidden in the basement was a storage locker. Inside were maps of the Everglades, old photographs of Jessica, and detailed notes tracking her daily schedule. He had been watching her for months. It became clear Gerald had orchestrated the entire thing. Nathan was unstable, angry, and easily manipulated. Gerald gave him a target, promised freedom, and used him to remove Jessica and Eli. But the question remained why. The final answer came from a DNA test. As part of the autopsy process, forensic analysts had run paternity tests using DNA found on Eli's belongings. The results stunned everyone. Nathan wasn't Eli's father. Gerald was. Detectives now believed Gerald had fathered Eli during a brief encounter years earlier, possibly without Jessica ever knowing. When she moved on and started a new life, Gerald grew obsessed. He likely convinced himself he had a right to the child, and when Jessica wouldn't allow it, or perhaps didn't even acknowledge him, he decided to destroy her and the life she built. But rather than take custody, Gerald made the sick decision to ensure no one could have Eli if he couldn't. Days later, Gerald's body was found deep in the Everglades. He had taken his own life, a gunshot wound to the head. A note was found nearby, sealed in plastic, dry and deliberate. It read, "They took what was mine. Now no one gets him." The case officially closed, but the horror left behind never did. Jessica and Eli's deaths weren't just senseless. They were the result of obsession, revenge, and twisted control. A mother stabbed over 100 times, a child fed to alligators, and a killer who disappeared into the swamp, leaving behind nothing but pain, silence, and questions that would haunt a community forever.